Welcome back, and now let's take another look and exploration on our theme, Design for a Change, and this time we will take a look on urban landscape.
We'll have the opportunity to hear from some of the world's most innovative thinkers to share their insights on building floating neighborhoods.
That's right, so let's take a look at the video.
By 2050, an estimated 6.2 billion people, or 70% of the global population, will be living in cities. But concentrating people in urban areas brings its own set of challenges, including impacts on health, livelihoods, and assets. Designers focused on the cities of the future must take into account a myriad of factors as they continue to adapt to the effects of climate change. Our panel today will discuss the ways in which design is rethinking urban space, both now and for the future. Dr. Koen Oothuis founded Water Studio in 2003 as the first office 100% focused on floating architecture. He advises governments and cities around the world on how to combat the effects of climate change and urbanization. His signature work includes the floating city in the Maldives, as well as floating parks, houses, and theaters in locations around the world. Martijn Pol is co-founder and partner at Space and Matter, where they implement fundamental principles for a circular economy and create generous and regenerative living environments, which are carbon neutral and energy positive. Pol also leads workshops and lectures internationally on adaptable design processes and human-centered developments. Sarah Combs is director at Zaha Hadid Architects, where she has been a fixture for 24 years. She specializes in construction methodology and concrete design, and she lectures on these subjects regularly for architecture schools and industry events. Leading this discussion will be Fei Mui, creator and architect. She served as a program committee chair at the American Institute of Architects Hong Kong in 2021 and committee chair of the Emerging Professionals Committee in 2022.
Welcome everyone to come back to our second session for the BODW evening. So today on stage, we're very happy to have Koen flying all the way from Netherlands to join us at this evening. Welcome, Koen.
Thank you.
And also we have Sarah from Zaha Hadid Architects joining us this evening. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
And online dialing in from the Netherlands, we also have Martijn joining us as well. Hello, Martijn.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to see you all today. So tonight we're going to talk about architecture that is no longer just talking about resilience to climate change. We're talking about actively combating climate change. So Koen, do you want to kickstart on our conversation on how do we use architecture to really combat climate change?
Yes, I would. The funny thing is, I was just in a plane and thinking about that when I was a child in the 70s, they asked me to design the city of the future. And I know that we were drawing and we were making this houses in the sky and flying cars. And now 50 years later, I'm still waiting for them to appear. And that also makes it, shows how difficult it is for us architects to think about the city of the future. Mm-hmm. How would it look like? And especially with climate change and with economical and environmental changes, you can't be ready. So what I think we should do, we should design for change. And for design for change, you need a recipe. And every designer should find his own recipe. And I think, for me, my recipe was living on the water. For living on water, of course, you have these old houseboats in Amsterdam, but we had to change them. We had to make them more ready for the floating cities. So that means a different kind of, to build them, better quality, making sure that they're in a legal framework, that they're like normal houses, that they're part of communities, that they also can produce their own energy and their food, that they are ready for floods for 15 feet going up and down in rivers. That's like you see here in the Netherlands. But also, next, larger platforms up to 50 by 50, 100 by 100 meters, for which you can multiple buildings can be placed on top of it. Small islands and floating apartment buildings on water, and they are all needed to create new neighborhoods on water. Next. Oh, one back, please. Yeah. So, but that's not all. I think if we really want to be ready for the future, we also have to change our cities from static cities to dynamic cities, and we should be able to order functions on demand. Now, a simple example is this kind of floating platforms we do for Dhaka in Bangladesh for testing on COVID, or even a floating theater is now almost ready in France. And it can be moved in 15 years to the next location in the city. Next. Oh, I'm back. Floating apartment buildings, affordable for the relief of the housing, for affordable housing. So they are all needed, and we can all bring them to the city. But even floating harbors, which can move from city to city. And if you have these kind of the projects, and you can order them on demand, then also you can answer change within the city. But to make them ready for the big audience, for the citizens, we have to build trust, and definitely trust on safety. What will happen in case of heavy weather, extreme weather. And a good example of that is the building we did in Miami, because that's, on a normal situation, is just very stable, laying on the water. But when there is a big storm, we are able to move it away and bring it to shelter water. And in the case of a hurricane, so extreme hurricanes, Hurricane 4, it's even possible to go to shallow water and to push the building up out of the water, almost 16 feet. So by that, waves can't hit that building anymore. So safety and trust is needed to get people enthusiastic. But of course, then the question arises, is this only for housing? No, it's also, I think, to enhance the public realm. We have to create floating parks. This is a project we do for Qatar, which is a 10 by 2 kilometers floating mangrove forest, really, really large, for people to step in. A floating park in Amsterdam, where all elements can move, and it's completely dynamic. And even floating towers, but not for people, but for animals, for birds and for fish to come together. So in trying to have an effect on that public space. Having these kind of neighborhoods in the Netherlands, they are of course a fantastic proof of concept, but to really make it a solution for our big cities, maybe even for Hong Kong or for New York, we have to grow in skill. And to do that is not just making more houses, but we have to go to modularity. And it's almost like you not building or constructing a city anymore, but it's more assembling a city of Lego blocks, bringing them together. And one of the projects we do in the Maldives, where we have already built the first floating houses, and these blocks will be adjusted, assembled to a complete city, where 5,000 people, 5,000 houses and 20,000 people will live together. And these things are needed for places where you can't build traditionally anymore, where reclamation isn't an answer, and where sea level rise will threaten almost a whole community. These kind of structures, these kind of city models can be tested in the Netherlands. There are all institutes who do that and who can already see how much movement you can expect and how rigid these kind of structures must be. So it's more than just ideas, it's really tested systems and ready for our cities. One other project that I like very much is a new kind of blue urban model for Panama. There is an investors, and they want to have housing that can be moved. So this is the seaport, and it's an open water, and it can be towed from one location to another location. And what the developers want over there is to create a whole fleet of these kind of seaports that can be placed on the water and that can be seasonal changed and can be adjusted. And sometimes the city will grow and sometimes the city will shrink. So this kind of reimagining floating communities is something that will, I think, make are ready for change. But in the end, I think the most comprehensive next step for cities is just pushing the city beyond the waterfront. The first developments that will just push over into the water and slowly grow. And in the end, the border between land and water will blur. I don't think that floating cities are that much different than cities on land. They have a different kind of foundation, but it doesn't have to be that life on that floating city is different. And I think also what is good that instead of reclamation, that we get cities that grow over water and that have much more a symbiotic kind of relation with nature. So these kind of cities, you can let them grow, but you can also take parts away. And underneath, you don't touch, or almost not touch, the seabed. What does this mean? Is this now, for me, a kind of plea for floating cities everywhere to grow? No, I don't think so. The only thing that I think that this kind of technology will bring is that we have to unlock the potential for cities to answer to climate change and to be ready for change. So I hope that designers all around the world will look at this kind of technology and try to bring this to the cities.
Lovely. Just out of curiosity, so for those who have ever built any project in Southeast Asia, we all know that the biggest challenge is not the weight of the building itself, it's more of the wind load. So especially when you're just building on the sea, a blue urban model, right? What is the strategy to combat this kind of a really super strong wind load, and especially during the monsoon season?
Well, of course we can build for every situation, only it's not always feasible. If you see the big oil platforms on the middle of the ocean with big waves and big storms, they can just last there.
Yes.
But if you take the same technology and want to build one house over here, that doesn't make sense. So it's always a balance between cost and location and size. But we can say that the larger the kind of platforms become, or the more they are interconnected to each other, the more they can resist these kind of extreme weather conditions. But always at the beginning, when we start, it starts with the engineers making the calculations, say, well, this is possible and this is not possible.
So when you talk about economy of scale, right, the larger the cluster is, the more stable it is. But then how would you compare that with traditional reclamation, just like build a piece of land instead of having these little pots standing on water?
Well, if you have to make a choice between reclamation and floating, then you always look at the location. In the Maldives, for instance, there, after the small reefs, it dives in almost to 100, 150 meters. So if you want to do any reclamation, you first have to put sand up to 150 meters. That doesn't make sense. So it's not one or the other. Each location has its preferences, and I think that floating developments, and even the ones that get larger, are slowly being an alternative for reclamation and places, and also because we don't touch the ecology underneath it. If you have a lot of corals and you place sand on top of it, everything dies. If you place floating structures next to it and you are careful of that, then they can live together, the buildings and the coral.
So it's like a symbiotic relationship between the built environment and the ocean.
Yeah, although I have to say we're still in a learning process, and for each of the projects we do, we have a research team that brings in information, we test, we measure, and we learn from it. So I hope in the next next city will be better.
Lovely. So talking about building on the sea, Netherlands definitely have a lot of experts in this arena. So switching to Martijn, do you also want to share with us your experience on building floating cities?
Yes, definitely. I think First, it starts with a short movie, and I have some slides summarizing the message I want to bring across.
Great. So let's watch the movie first.
I'm Martijn Pol, one of the 3 founders of Space and Matter, which in its core is a architectural and urban planning design office. We actually started asking questions ourselves, like what is our role, what is our position, what do we believe we have to offer to the built environment, how can we make the built environment more sustainable, look after the people that need affordable housing, really push the projects we believe in most, and that makes us kind of a unique kind within the spectrum of design offices worldwide. Can we also maximize ecosystem restoration, include biodiversity, and actually integrate landscapes? We believe we should create the built environment not separated from a natural environment, but be part of the natural environment. So there is the willingness to actually invest more in the sustainable performance of the building, because it's a return on investment in the long run, which makes sense if you're in it for the long run. And we see that through our approach, we can raise the bar and raise the ambitions for our projects to come to life, which sets them apart from the rest. The Common Woods project is a neighborhood project. It consists of 56 households. There's a smart grid. There's even decentralized sanitation. So this makes the neighborhood self-sufficient, socially inclusive, embedding biodiversity back into the built environment. Schoon Schip is a unique project in its sense that it's not built on land, but it's actually sitting in the water. It's a floating neighborhood project. It's a dynamic building. So thinking through the lines of a micro-society, you might say, 46 households living together. They harvest the energy from the sun themselves and they distribute it equally. It makes us think, can we produce the energy we consume ourselves? It's really a living system that operates and that actually offers more to its residents than a regular building. If we do something, we don't want to do it just for once. It has to be replicable and scalable. We're very fortunate to be sitting in the city of Amsterdam and actually explore our terrain and push our knowledge boundaries, living in a context that's very open-minded. So that allows us to really showcase these pilot projects or first stage projects. And then from the city of Amsterdam and actually the larger context of the Netherlands, get out into the world. And I think the Business of Design Week and the Asian context might be a very fruitful context for us. One of our first endeavors in China brought us to Chonghua, where we've created a radically new kind of interpretation of a hotel consisting of multiple buildings, a restaurant building, a spa building, the reuse of an old factory where the buildings and the natural ecosystem actually become one. Part of this organism, part of this loop, which is very obvious, but which we have grown apart from. So that's something we want to re-establish. Considering the very high densities and being dealt with in large cities as Hong Kong or Guangzhou or Shanghai, even Beijing. We also have developed a prototype for vertically organizing neighborhoods that also have a maximum of social value and interaction and enhancing the biodiversity, but still maintaining the proposition of a socially inclusive, self-supportive, organized neighborhood. If you're capable of explaining a project that has been tested and validated already before, the follow-up and the speed of development is enormous in China. And that's what we believe China has to offer to us. And that's what we have to offer to China.
That's a lot of very interesting projects, and I have a ton of questions for Martijn already. But I also know that Martijn prepared a little bit more follow-up information to tell us more about your projects, right, Martijn?
Exactly. Just a few more slides in a few minutes. And what I've already addressed in a small movie is how to bring back the balance and nature. And we work a lot in the built environment itself, but we see the built environment not separate from nature, but how can we make natural aspects and environmental values inclusive into our built environments? Because in the end, it's better for the sense of well-being and the health of our citizens in our projects. We have some land-based projects, and this project was already showcased in the movie, and the floating project, working alongside also with Koen on this project, where we've been capable of opening up the process to the community in a very early stage, and they were thinking with us in the development and the design discourse, eventually realizing higher standards of collective space, public space, and the space for social interaction, like you would have encountered in a sidewalk in a city, but how to create these values also in a floating project like this. And actually not just looking at the water, but also looking underneath the water. And how can we restore the marine biodiversity? And because the water is actually our host, and the land we sit on is the water we are part of. And looking at the water condition and from the energy supply, but also can we enhance the water quality and bring back the marine biodiversity, which has been eroded in our urban deltas. And by actually thinking about these floating projects, we see the floating project as an instrument to bring back that marine life. And by actually looking at the floating foundations to be artificial reefs that really have a positive impact on the underwater circumstances. And I'm thinking about future projects and smaller social clusters in different configurations, which is also in the fourth dimension, just what Koen also mentioned already. You can cluster and adapt and reconfigure these kind of settlements. And luckily, we're not the only ones propagating this, and this has been addressed by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations also, and that floating is a domain still to be uncovered a lot more and more actively to really deal with city densities and tackle the challenges of climate change and sea level rise, and actually proposing projects that are energy self-sufficient and nature inclusive. And then just a few more slides on our endeavors indeed in China is a project in Chonghua, where we've envisioned a small urban delta where a river was canalized, and we actually proposed to decanalize, and so actually open up the space for the river to really make wetland again, and then create a hospitality environment, and so hotel rooms, restaurant, and spa, to really be part of this natural ecosystem, and a very rich natural ecosystem. And what's expressed in Chinese characters here, it's Qinggong. It's the strength of nature. Nature works, and how can we work with nature as a design instrument practice? And actually looking at the section of this small urban delta, what is the fertile land interaction between water and land, and how can we actually create the loops within this landscape, and really re-establishing this living landscape also for our visitors to become aware of this living, rich organism where you're just part of for 24 hours or 48 hours. And here we've transformed a ruin into a hotel space where actually the park goes into the old building, and we've added small lofts on the left and right side where a artificial ruin and an old building and the landscape are already in symbiosis with each other, and then adding this hotel experience. This is the transformation of a concrete structure which was left by the riverbank, which we've actually elevated into a, well, let's say a roof park, and actually having the river flow over the roof of this building, and that the building really becomes part of this small living landscape. Well, another example of a spa sitting in this beautiful natural environment. And so to just give a source of inspiration, looking at water, looking at landscapes, looking at the rich and forces of nature, and how can we incorporate that in design strategies. And we tend to focus on the built environment as something artificially created, yes, and that's partly true. But how can we really make it into living organisms that stand the challenges we face in terms of sea level rise or bouncing back biodiversities, energy self-sufficiencies, etc.
Right. So, Martin, your projects are not just talking about minimizing your impact on the environment. Instead, you're really creating positive impact on the marine environment, right? Another very interesting point that I spotted in your presentation is about the social inclusive neighborhood, and how you also include homeowners or end users in the very early on process when you are creating this neighborhood. Can you share with us a little bit more about the design process and how you encourage the participation of the end user at the early stage of the design process?
Yeah, interesting question. Indeed, that addresses the Schoon Schip project and the floating neighborhood project, where actually the idea originated from one of the residents, and starting with the description of her dreamlike situation. How do I want to live? Where do I want my kids to grow up? And she encountered a houseboat in the Netherlands, which was energy self-sufficient, treating its own wastewaters, growing bits of food supply. But actually, to really have an impact, and you can think of, okay, do I do this for my own good, or can I scale this up and actually surround myself with neighbors and really build the neighborhood I want to be part of? And that's also where the economy of scale kicks in. Because at a certain scale, in this case, 46 households working together as a small satellite organization, a kind of micro-society, we were capable of actually raising the bar and raising the ambitions of what the neighborhood should offer. And can we really go towards energy positive? Can we really go towards nature inclusion and enhance the biodiversity as the water is treating us as a host, and how can we treat our host to be really in symbiosis in beneficial circumstances for both of us? And I believe these ambitions could only be realized because we work closely together with the residents, and because the residents are in it for the long run. It's not that a developer or investor says, I want to start this project, make some money, and turn my back and go to the next project. Now, this project was developed by the community themselves, and they want to be energy independent, and even the sewage is decentralized, so they created their own micro biorefinery to do the sewage treatment decentralized, disconnected from the land, which makes them a very strong self-operating satellite, and they don't feel the energy crisis and the doubling or tripling of energy cost these days, so it makes them very resilient to the changes happening in society these days. So yes, indeed, and we work closely together with future residents at an early stage in the development and design discourse, because we see we can increase the quality and we can raise the bar of ambitions to be realized.
So this is quite a different development model, right, compared to what we're more used to in Hong Kong, which is developer-led. Rather, you're in one go developing a dream houses for 40-some households, which must be quite a challenge. We'll come back to that. I'm super interested in it. Recently, we've paid a visit to Sarah's office, and we've made a little video that talks about their work. So let's watch that video.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a director at Zahadid Architects and currently based in Hong Kong. I came to Hong Kong in order to lead one of our projects here in Hong Kong, the Henderson. But as a director, I'm involved in all aspects of leading this company. In architecture, you have to react to environmental changes and conditions. We've always done this. I mean, architecture at its beginning was there to give you a shelter. Now climate changes and we adapt. But I think ultimately what we need to do is to minimize climate change. So I think we need to go one step further and not only react to the changes we are experiencing, but actually pushing forward an architecture which helps to avoid worsening changes. I do believe that blue and green infrastructure is important for any city. You know, we need to incorporate more green spaces in order to bring down temperatures and improve the air quality, to aid people in the city to live with the environment instead of fighting against it. And I think also blue infrastructure is important because we need to manage extreme rainfalls in a way that flooding, for example, is avoided. If I talk about the interaction between our buildings here in Hong Kong and the public realm, the open spaces, the Henderson is a good example because instead of doing the typical skyscraper comes down to the ground, blocks out the ground and creates this very harsh sort of outside-inside relationship, we lifted the building up, we let the park flow underneath it and the footbridge network. We let, in a way, the public realm flow into the building and seek to open up the relationship between the building and its environment. In Hong Kong, we are this close to the water that, of course, the rising sea levels need to be taken into account. Now, what can we do about it here? It's not possible to have flood defenses like we have in London. Of course, you can move to higher ground, Of course, you can start building buildings which take into consideration that there may be floods in the lower levels, like what you see in Miami. I think there need to be active policies which allow the developers to, probably for developers and their clients, to incorporate green spaces. There are regulations for this. We have to incorporate certain green areas, but we could increase that. We could actively promote more green spaces and open spaces in the city. Sustainability is something we incorporate in every building by now. I mean, sustainability means, if you break it down, it means, first of all, we need to optimize the building in order to reduce its energy consumption and its embodied carbon. And then we need to also positively enhance its usage. We need to ensure that, we promote not bringing in your plastic bottle, but we have water fountains. You also educate people with the buildings. I do hope that Hong Kong takes sustainability much more seriously. The policies are there to support it, and that I think it's generally happening all over the world. People are realizing we need to become better and do more in terms of sustainability. I don't see that Hong Kong will not do that, but I think we need to help and come together in order to do more, basically. I think at the moment it's still the biggest challenge is that it is frustrating that we could do so much more, and in a way the world still has to catch up to it ultimately. If clients and cities see true immediate value, then it will change way faster.
So, for change to happen faster, we need at least two parties to help us, right? One is the client, one is the city. So are you a believer of the stick strategy or the carrot?
I think it needs, I mean, it's not only the city and the client. I think it's ultimately also its future users, right? I do think that you need both, probably. You need a bit of force and you need incentive and motivation. And I guess in terms of force, or as you call it, stake, it would be regulatory demand. I think it's not fast enough if we just wait for everyone to catch up with it and see it's really important and finally say, okay, we're doing more now. I think there needs to be regulations which need to catch up. And they are better in some countries and worse in others. And Hong Kong is not at the top, So I would love to see here more incentive and also more force of making sure the envelope is fully insulated. It doesn't make a difference whether it's outside warm or cold. You still have a temperature differential. If you lose too much temperature through the envelope, you're not energy efficient. That's one thing. Then I think Hong Kong also has the added difficulty that there are such intense GFA pressures that it's extremely difficult for a client or a developer to say, okay, we are doing a double facade. We are putting a lot of external louvers on the facade because they come to a certain degree with a GFA punishment, and no one is incentivized enough to do that. So you can apply force, but I think on the other hand, there needs to be also motivation, and motivation can be credits, let's say, if you have sustainable or renewable energy usage, or financing credits, for example, but then also education of the end user and the clients.
Yeah.
Because I think ultimately the future users, they will demand much more that the building is green, and future investors will need assets which are still good assets in 15 years. So in the end, everyone has to come from all angles, so it goes a bit faster because we are far too slow.
Right. There's always a saying that climate change or the money that you put into fight climate change, especially into architecture, is not something that you can see immediately. The effect kind of comes in the years after, right? So has the market really changed to adapt to this kind of thinking, would you say?
It is changing, but slowly. I think. I mean, you see it more and more. Of course, everyone wants to tick the box. Everyone wants to have a lead and all the little credits which are out there. But I think people are realizing that it needs more. So I think that it is changing, definitely.
Yeah. Koen, I know that you, besides working in the Netherlands, you also practice or have projects elsewhere in the other parts of the world. Would you say, compared to the rest of the world, is Netherlands in terms of this kind of regulation and the thinking of the end users, the developers? Would you guys say that you are more at the front end, or how would you?
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. I think the architects, like Martijn and many more, we are at the front. We have the ideas, the visions, we want to know what to do. But the Netherlands has a history of fighting against the water. So we've always seen water as an enemy. And to make that change, to see water as a friend, and to understand that the safest place to be if your city is threatened by the water is to already be on top of the water, yeah, that's something new. So we see that in the Netherlands we have only 10% of our work. Mostly it's in other countries where it's new and where they're easier to adjust rules and regulations. Mostly ook in countries that have a kind of different kind of democracy, that also helps. Like where we work in Panama with that big floating community. They're willing to change the rules and regulations easier. And it starts with us as architects. If we don't show the authorities how a different city can be, then they can't change the rules. So,
sure. I mean, it is interesting when you say in Netherlands the enemy is the water. I think here in Hong Kong the enemy is the climate. It's not so much the water. Yeah. Yes, sure. There's sea levels which are going to come up, and then there's a lot of water which comes down in a short time when it rains. But ultimately, here is a fight against the heat and the humidity in a way and it would be nice if we would work more here together with the climate, right? Which is why I was saying, you know, it makes a much difference if you incorporate more open spaces, more green spaces, if you have semi-open spaces in between buffer zones, those kind of elements, you bring those back into buildings and into the city, then you would also encourage a more living together.
I think your point of climate change being the enemy, I think it's a blessing, because it helps us a lot. If there was no climate change, we would still throw in oil as much as we can.
No, I mean, I'm sorry, I meant to say the climate here is the enemy. It's because it's so hot.
Okay, yeah, but...
Not climate change.
Well, maybe that's a good point. We see water not only as a place to build on, but also like a kind of blue battery. The work we do in the Maldives, we pump up water from 700 meters depth. It's very cold, 5 degrees. We bring it to the city and we use it for our air conditioning system. So with that, we have a reduction of 30% of the energy needs. So it's as how we look at the water, it's just one source of space, of energy, of flexibility, and that we try to push to cities like here.
Sure.
One point that you guys pointed out, both you and Martijn pointed out, in the floating city, in the merit of floating city, is that it has certain flexibility and adaptability, that the city can easily be reconfigured, almost like a bunch of ships, based on the need, based on the weather, based on the condition. I think, would you say that such strategy is applicable to very dense city in, say, Southeast Asia, like Hong Kong, Tokyo? Because I know what Sarah is talking about. It's more like seems like we're fighting different battles. In Hong Kong, we're dealing with the heat, we're dealing with the super high density. Would that kind of answers be offered by floating city, do you think?
Well, I think so. Not everything can be answered by a floating city, definitely not. But it gives some new opportunities. Also here in Hong Kong, you have different kind of climates and seasons during the year. We have the storm season and the more dry season. And I can imagine that parts of the city are reconfigured to answer the needs of that season better. Another thing is that I also don't believe that in Hong Kong you should just build on the water to create more housing. It just have to be flexible elements that are helping the city to perform better. And whether that are parks or housing or offices or energy power systems, I don't care. But it has to help the city.
Martijn, do you think there is a potential for the blue urban model to be applicable to Asian cities, especially dealing with such high density?
I think definitely, and we cannot reach similar densities as compared to like high rises on land. But on the other hand, I think the time for a high rise to be and the zoning and the permitting and the construction, etc., before it actually happens and takes place, compared to a more rapid response model of the urban models, for example, you can start realizing a floating neighborhood of 50, and then in a half-year time, another 50, and in this of time, let's say 5 years, it also consists of, I don't know, 400 households or maybe 800 households in the water, because it's more of an organic modular growth model where actually a lower threshold for planning and policy and regulation should be in place, and I think might already be in place. It's almost like the low-hanging fruit, and how can we respond to affordable housing crisis, energy crisis, sea level rise way faster? Because we feel the urgency, we need to do more and aim for higher quality at a lower cost in a faster pace. I really believe that, and as a condition, and once to work with these conditions and work with the force of nature, and like you can see it as a threat, but actually it's a strong force, and nature is acting upon it. So let's have nature do its work. Consider nature and the force of nature as an ally in everything we do, and then we become a force for good, a threat, but see it as an ally to make better, and actually use the dynamic conditions, for example, of the water to be adaptable, reconfigurable. And a last note, also just mentioned, and to use the aquathermal and the energy the oceans have to offer and the CO2 sequestering of the ocean, etc. A beautiful, simple example of what nature has learned, but I think it's not enough in our tool, and we can and beautiful projects, and of course we also have to show example and pilot, and that's what we can offer from the Netherlands as a small country, showing example proof of projects that could be scaled up in, for example, Asia, and because I think the speed is higher and the willingness to invest in these replicable models is a very large potential. And so I see actually the Netherlands as the incubator, but then in Asia we opportunities for the of what we've tested in the Netherlands.
Right. So you just hit all the key words that all the clients want to hear. Cheaper, faster, more affordable, better, gives itself energy. So we got some questions from our audience online. And the first question, of course, is about cost. So is building floating architecture more expensive than building conventional ones? Is it just like building a gigantic ship? Is that technology already ready for use, Koen?
I think floating buildings are more expensive than on land, but it's not the cost of construction, it's the cost of development you have to look at. Because if you can get a location on water that's cheaper than location on land, and then the total cost of development can be lower. And then there's also durability. The same if you buy a nice car, after 5 years, you're not going to demolish your car, but you're going to sell it to somebody else. So if you have floating buildings and maybe after 20 years or 50 years or 70 years, you get a new owner and it can be used for 100 years instead of being demolished. So that's also durability and sustainability.
So if you count in the long-term cost, it might actually be more affordable and cheaper compared to a conventional building.
We're only at the beginning there, and I think the scalability will bring costs down.
Right. Building sustainably often costs more at the beginning, but then it pays off over time. So, Sarah, would you give us a little bit of closing remarks, or in terms of building sustainable architecture in Hong Kong, what would you say is our future lies in?
Our future what?
Where do you think our future lies in to create more sustainable architecture in Hong Kong?
yeah, I think we need better policies. I think we need 1 or 2 innovative projects which maybe spark the mood for change even quicker. And then we have to make sure that everyone knows as much as possible about sustainability and how to build sustainably in order to educate the future users and clients.
Thank you, guys. It's been a wonderful session and discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. What a showcase of groundbreaking projects and innovative concepts. Who would ever thought that urban environment could be like this?
It was definitely very intriguing. Now, after our break, we'll have our last session of the night, integrating the future of transportation, integrating mobility and community, which gives us a glimpse of the latest technologies in transportation. Stay tuned.